character action games. Of all the subgenres out there, I'm not sure there are many that are less helpful as descriptors. So it's an action game where you play as a character. Sure, that's nice and specific. You could spend ages discussing the details of what makes a character action game, the exact degree of technicality to the combat system, or the levels of their respective skill floors and ceilings, but the truth is it's easier to just say games like Devil May Cry. The original released in 2001 and was a big hit, spawning not just its own series but the entire subgenre. It's a widely influential work, even beyond its own niche in the industry. However, and I recognise this is going to be rather an egregious faux pas, I'm not sure the original is as great as people say. Don't get me wrong, I like the Devil May Cry series, including this first one, but the game as it exists, not as it's remembered, is a rather uneven and deeply flawed work. Not a masterpiece in its own right, but certainly proof that such a game could be. A lot of this is due to a quirk of its development. Devil May Cry started life as the earliest attempt to develop Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4's development was somewhat turbulent to say the least, and would hit more than a few dead ends. It's thought that at least 4 different projects were discarded before the final version was released. The first version, directed by Hideki Kamiya, would then be spun off into Devil May Cry. As such, there are a lot of similarities with earlier Resident Evil games within it, and indeed many similarities with what would become Resident Evil 4, but often those clash with the core of what drew people to the game in the first place, and what would make the series popular in the long run. Beat-em-ups obviously existed before Devil May Cry, with games such as Double Dragon, Streets of Rage and Golden Axe having been popular for over a decade at the time of its release. It wouldn't even be the first in the genre to exist in 3D. The defining feature of Devil May Cry, and as a result the character action subgenre in general, would be precision and skill. A lot of prior works could end up devolving into button mashing to quickly get combos out, but Devil May Cry counters this with the pause combo. One of, if not the earliest game to use the system, a pause combo deliberately introduces a brief delay in inputs to change the attack pattern. 3 hits of the attack gives one sequence, but a brief pause after the second attack leads to a different one, and a third if the player pauses slightly longer. Mashing the attack buttons as fast as you can will no longer provide you with the best results, forcing players to play more deliberately. The combat system is actually quite limited in the first game. Of the 4 melee weapons available, 3 share broadly the same moveset, while the 4th uses a charge attack system instead. Each weapon only has access to a few basic combos and 1 or 2 special moves, all backed up with a choice of ranged weapons. Weapon switching is done almost entirely within menus, with only 2 weapons being able to switch from one to the other in-game, and even then it's a slow process that requires clearing space first. The systems here are simple and limited, especially compared to later games, which is why it feels more like a proof of concept than something actually good in its own right. That is, by today's standards, mind you. At the time, it was something of a major step forward, but looking back, it feels slow, with limited options compared to what it would develop into. The other defining feature is the style meter. So iconic is the style meter that when it gets adapted into other types of action games, such as shooters like Ultra Kill or Bright Memory and its sequel, they often get referred to as Devil May Cry with guns. An odd epithet given that Devil May Cry already has guns, but you understand the point. The mechanic itself, especially in this early rendition, is effectively a combo meter with flair. So long as you continue to attack your enemies without stopping, your style meter will grow, from rank D all the way up to rank S. By grading the player as they fight, this system clearly expresses how it wants to be played. This is how you should be playing, it says, this is not. It encourages a very aggressive style of play, never letting up your attacks or you'll lose your rank. Later games would expand upon this further by encouraging not just aggression, but variation. You can muddle your way through the game, but it will actively encourage you to play fast and play well. This active encouragement to play without making a mistake, and showing the player clearly when they aren't playing in what the game considers the optimal way, is one of the things that gives the game its reputation for difficulty. Devil May Cry is often notorious for its difficulty, though whether it deserves that notoriety is a point we'll get to in a moment. It's worth taking a moment to discuss how it divides up its difficulty settings though. These days, discussions of difficulty settings can often devolve into mudslinging contests pretty quickly, but I do think Devil May Cry is a good example of how to implement them. I fully support the inclusion of difficulty settings in games. It's the only way to ensure a wide range of players can actually experience the game as it's intended. One player may find easy as difficult as another would find hard, so having both available ensures they both get a challenging experience. Devil May Cry locks both its hard and easy difficulties off the bat, however. The hard I'm kind of against, only my hard drive says that I haven't beaten this game before, so it would be nice to have access to it from the start. Easy being locked, however, is a point I quite like. You need to die a few times in one of the earlier levels in order to access it. This ensures the players who genuinely struggle will have access to it, but reduces the chance of unsure players dropping the difficulty too low and having a weaker experience because of it. Ensuring the player can have the experience the developers intend, while still accounting for players of differing skill levels can be tricky. You don't want people to have the difficulty too low or too high for the optimal experience, so starting at default and allowing you to lower it only at a certain threshold presents a far better chance of achieving this balance. An aspect I'm less on board with, however, is automatic mode, or at least its implementation. The feature would repair in later games, and I'm in favour of it in general. It simplifies inputs to make combos and attacks easier to execute. The problem is, in this first game, it is tied exclusively to the easy mode, and more importantly, can't be disabled. Shaving a percentage off enemy damage or boosting the player is good, but also locking the easier players into a different control scheme means they won't have a space in which to practice those controls properly. Increasing the difficulty setting in a game requires improving execution of a game's mechanics, but here, the player on the lowest setting doesn't have complete access to those mechanics, so it's not just a case of adjusting to be able to execute them more consistently, but learning them all over again if you want to move up to normal. Of course, at some point, all this relies on the difficulty of the game being satisfying. I don't think Devil May Cry is. Enemies do a lot of damage, especially bosses, leaving little room for mistakes, but the enemies are very rarely challenging in an interesting way. Your toolset isn't massive, so it rarely takes long to work out which mechanics are most effective against an enemy, and then simply repeating that until it's dead. Even the toughest enemies in the game can be defeated by identifying patterns and then exploiting them, without requiring as much on-the-fly decision-making as one might like. The difficulty instead often comes from the game's true toughest enemy, the camera. Devil May Cry inherited a series of fixed camera angles from its days as an early version of Resident Evil game. These camera angles are still set up for a claustrophobic castle adventure, not a high-octane action game. Constantly, you'll find yourself attacked by enemies off-screen, or worse, Dante will be hidden behind a boss, making it impossible to see what you're doing. It also makes targeting enemies difficult. Devil May Cry wants to be a skillful game with precise attacks. There's a degree of auto-lock to the combat which is useful most of the time, but often enough, changing angles and unclear directional controls will lead you to attacking the wrong enemy at a critical moment. When I talked about the more modern character action game Solstice a while back, I was kind of lukewarm on its use of fixed camera angles. Having remembered how bad they make both combat and platforming here, I feel like I owe that game an apology. The original God of War would also use fixed camera angles, but they tended to be drawn back further, and Kratos' wide-arcing attacks meant hitting specific enemies wasn't so much of a problem. It's not that fixed camera angles are inherently bad for this type of game, it's that they're poorly implemented for what the game wants to be. This would be improved as the series goes on, but for now it's something you have to struggle against that detracts from what the game is trying to be. This is why I'm not sure the game deserves its reputation for difficulty. Only about half my deaths felt fair, the other were due to some kind of wonky camera work either in the fight directly, or in an earlier fight that left me worse off than I should have been. You can, of course, heal yourself, but this brings us to another peculiarity. Since the red orbs you receive from defeating enemies are your currency for both consumables and new skills, you're limited in your ability to utilise the full suite of tools available to you, but only if you suck at the game. A better player will complete levels quicker and defeat enemies with a higher style rank, both of which increase the red orbs you gain. The result is, the player who may need the advantage of a few extra tries at a mission or a heal partway through a boss is far less likely to have access to them. Even a moderate player is unlikely to fully unlock their full skill set on a single playthrough, so if you buy the consumables you're going to be weaker overall, but at the same time, if you're good enough to have orbs to spare, you aren't going to need them in the first place. Yellow orbs act as a redo for the specific fight, and lacking them will revert you to the start of the mission, but again, a skilled player doesn't need them, and a weaker player won't have as easy a time accessing them. The same is true of the health upgrades, which are not only purchasable, but also hidden around the world and in secret missions. The mission structure of the game is really strange overall, actually. The castle on Malay Island feels like it was designed to be explored in a more sprawling non-linear game, like a Resident Evil game for example, but it's repurposed to be strictly linear through its missions. It's a gorgeous gothic space with some baroque touches if the detailing of baroque architecture had been subtly inspired by H.R. Giger. You're more or less free to wander in and out of as much of the castle as you have access to at any given time, but the missions expect you to do specific things in specific rooms in a set order. Backtracking or exploration are entirely unnecessary except when the mission is precisely that. If you do backtrack freely, you may come upon secret missions to gain extra resources, but they're only present during certain missions. A room doesn't contain a secret mission unless you enter it during the correct main mission, otherwise it's just a room. This leads to a situation where the start of a mission often makes it advantageous to immediately turn around and return to where you came from to access secret missions that just spawned behind you. The space, and indeed the puzzles based on strange key items, certainly feels like another holdover from its days as Resident Evil 4, which would also go on to feature a castle during its second act. Devil May Cry's second act proceeds to the outskirts of the island and feels much more linear, as do its final chapters in Hell, and as a result they feel more in line with the mechanics the game is going for, even if they do also feature the game's thankfully limited underwater segments. Each overarching chapter of the game is headed up by a boss, with another who dogs your steps throughout. The game's bosses are decent enough on their own, but with the exception of the final boss you'll face each 2 or 3 times at minimum, with very little mechanical change between each encounter. The only boss this really works with is Nilo Angelo. He crops up 3 times throughout the game, each time having access to a few extra moves. He's also the only humanoid of the group, making for the enemy with the closest moveset to Dante in the game. The closest thing Dante has to an equal, which always leads to his fights feeling more exciting and reactive than the flaming scorpions or giant eagles of the others. He's also the only boss with any real plot relevance. Nilo Angelo is Dante's long-lost brother Vergil. He's underbaked here, but will be more important later in the series, where he will once again fulfill this kind of boss fight. The story in general is barely relevant. Dante is the son of a famous devil who turned against his own kind and married a human. His parents and brother were killed at the hands of Mundus, and now Dante has a lead on where to find him. I'll describe the overall tone as exaggerated Japanese melodrama, because it doesn't sound like I enjoy it if I call it stupid anime bullshit. The game starts with Dante being approached by a woman named Trish, who introduces herself by impaling him with his own sword and throwing a motorbike at him, so you can quickly tell the proceedings are going to be as camp can be. The game has some of the dumbest dialogues and worst line readings you'll find, and that feels very much intentional. There aren't really any unexpected twists or complex machinations going on, it's a straight shot through the castle and into hell to take on Mundus. The only exception being Trish herself, who was created by Mundus with the express purpose of luring Dante to the island in the first place. He did so by making her look like Dante's dead mother, which is a Freudian nightmare we aren't going to dig into here, aside from pointing out that it's dumb and I hate it. Mundus isn't a particularly engaging villain, but he's a worse set of boss fights. I like his design. Emerging from the fleshy tunnels of the Demon Realm into the angelic white marble columns of Mundus's throne room is a nice twist, and him effectively taking on the form of a statue, concealing the same lava-esque flesh within as the mouthy scorpion from earlier in the game is a nice touch. But actually fighting him is just a series of gimmick fights. First in a kind of shoot-em-up sequence, then on foot but with a specific mechanic of building your super meter to take him out. The only time you fight him with the actual mechanics you've been using all game, it's more or less a victory lap and he's a pushover. It doesn't make good use of the combat systems you've been using all game, so it's a real letdown. The fights are far less memorable than something like Nilo Angelo's were. Finally, the game ends the same way Resident Evil 4 would, with the protagonist and his female sidekick escaping an exploding island before vaguely flirting in a way that's uncomfortable. Don't get me wrong, Devil May Cry is a good game. I like it a lot, and I completely understand how it could become such a smash hit. The combat system is still good to this day, and for its time it was revolutionary, but it lacks the polish and features that later games would add. It's a fantastic first run at a new genre, but it's also very clearly a first run at it, with the combat far simpler than it would become later, and the surrounding systems and structure not fully cohering or complementing it. Later games in the series would improve upon it greatly, taking the groundwork laid here and building upon it, expanding and polishing mechanics while placing them in a context that works better. It's a lot like Wolfenstein 3D in a way, not the first of its type, nor the game that would cement its particular genre in the popular consciousness, but a clear indicator that there's something special here, that the formula has great potential. It wouldn't be the next game in the series that realises that potential though. I think I might actually like Devil May Cry 2. Any fans of the series are probably reeling in horror after saying that. The game is universally reviled amongst the fandom, even more so than the temporary reboot of the franchise we'll talk about later. Most fans are genuinely surprised Devil May Cry 2 didn't kill the series and will regularly tell newcomers to skip it. Go to any forum thread asking which of the two campaigns to play first, and the answer, move straight on to Devil May Cry 3, is always the most common one. This was actually one of the reasons I wanted to cover the series. There are several highly regarded entries, so to also have something quite so heavily panned is fascinating. It and 5 are the only two games in the series I hadn't played before starting this project, and I had to know just how bad it was. It wasn't as bad as people make it out to be, which is almost disappointing in its own way. To be clear, the game isn't good. It's a significant downgrade from the first, and compares even less favourably to what comes afterwards, but in a strange way, I also found that while it is far worse than its predecessor, it's somehow also much closer to being as good as its successors. The complaints surrounding Devil May Cry 2 are numerous, and we'll tackle most of them before we're done, with one of the most common being the changes to Dante himself. While his presentation shifts subtly throughout the series, the version here is a clear outlier. Personally, I quite like it, but I can understand the change being unwelcome. He's far less vocal, less cocky than before. This can come across as less fun, and it is less fun than later representations, but I found the change also made Dante feel more competent. The earlier game's witty repartee before fights often came across as arrogant and self-aggrandizing, whereas the calmer, less obnoxious sequels feels more like confidence. In the original, Dante felt like he was trying to convince everyone he would win. In the sequel, there's no doubt. It also has one of my favourite bits of characterization in the series. Throughout the game, Dante carries a coin which he flips to make decisions, most commonly as to whether he's going to help people. Naturally, the coin is double-sided. The duality of deliberately exuding an air of disconnection, of acting disinterested, while also guaranteeing that he's going to help when people need it, is a good one. It feels like a far more mature rendition of the character, and combined with what is likely my favourite visual design he's had throughout the series, I do wish we could have seen more of it, though I've nothing against how future renditions would pan out. You shouldn't play his campaign first, however. That's the answer to all those forum threads, by the way. Lucia's campaign should come first. This is for a lot of reasons. Even with both campaigns, the game's overall length is shorter than the first, and Lucia's is the shorter campaign of the two, but it's also the more cohesive. The narrative isn't particularly large or complex in either. There is a man named Arius, he wants to become all-powerful by releasing a demon, you need to stop him. Lucia has a more personal connection to the narrative, however, being an inhabitant of the island Arius's megacorporation has now taken over, and she's also present for more important events. Playing her campaign presents a bare-bones plot with even less going on than the original, but from Dante's perspective, you end up missing several important bits of context as well, making the narrative hard to follow if it's your first time through. The other reason is that by playing a new character, you have time to get used to the new combat systems in a way that won't garner as many comparisons. Pause combos are out. Now combos change based on your movement inputs. In place of delays, now holding a directional input at certain points in your basic combo changes it. In theory, this requires the same kind of control discipline as the pauses do. The problem is, mashing the analog stick is rarely the element of controlling a game that makes it feel messy, and the new system does nothing to discourage button mashing, resulting in what feels like a loss of precision. It gives you access to more combos than the original, but they're less distinct from one another, more universally viable, which masks the increase in variety. The biggest problem with the combat system is often cited as the changes to ranged weapons. Common consensus goes that they're overpowered and make all other weapons obsolete. Dante's guns and Lucia's throwing knives now not only do massive amounts of damage, but will air juggle standard enemies without even needing to knock them into the air with a sword first. I'd argue this isn't as big a problem as people make it out to be. True, ranged attacks are far more powerful than they were before, but if they were truly overpowered, they could have ended up being fun. The problem is they're just powerful enough to be a crutch. You can make it through almost the entire game with just your ranged weapons, even bosses who often lack the first game's defences against such tactics. If you do, this game will be very boring indeed. It is the easiest way to be the most powerful, which in a game that promotes optimising your gameplay and not getting hit feels almost irresistible. It is still weaker than using your melee weapons to its fullest extent, however. Certainly most bosses can be cheesed with ranged weapons, and there are some which you absolutely should, but you will have a much better time if you try to play the game using the same mix of guns and swords the original promoted. It's harder to get to the point where you're enjoying the combat system because the game doesn't force you to. Because the crutch of just standing back and shooting is always there, you don't have to engage with the more interesting elements of the game's combat in the way that you would in the original. This is a problem, certainly, but I'm not sure it's fair to lambast the game for a mechanic that, however flawed, can be mitigated with a little restraint. The actual worst part of the combat system is the new lock-on mechanic. There's no longer a soft lock as standard and then a hard lock when you need it. Now you're hard locked by default, and the lock-on button simply stops it from changing. It's so much harder to direct your attacks in larger fights now, making the fun moments of shifting from enemy to enemy within a large brawl feel fewer and further between as you struggle to attack the right opponent. This becomes true of boss fights too, where enemies with multiple parts close together can have you focusing down the wrong part of the boss at a critical moment. It becomes truly unbearable in one of the worst fights in the game, where you're constantly locked onto the boss's adds and unable to lock onto the floating environmental elements you need to destroy. You can disable the lock entirely, but as you might have guessed, that disables the lock entirely. You'll fly past enemies, missing them with your attacks, and you can't reposition yourself mid-combo because trying to move changes the combo you're using, rather than changing where it's aimed. The issues with ranged combat can be downplayed by simply limiting your use of them, but the lock-on will make every fight worse. It's a shame, because once you get past that, the combat does show several improvements over its predecessor. You can now switch your ranged weapons mid-fight without dropping into a menu, though your melee weapons on each character are restricted to a trio of the same basic weapon that trade range for damage or vice versa. There's also now a dedicated dodge button and air combos, both of which make for significant improvements over the original. There's even a nice detail where each character's special Devil Trigger mode has a slightly different set of properties. Lucia's has access to a particularly powerful special attack, meanwhile Dante's has a secret second form that only activates when used with less than 10% of your health bar remaining. There are moments in the game where everything clicks, where combos, dodges and gunplay start to flow from one to the other seamlessly as your style rank builds. These moments feel great, as good as the original at times, but they're far less common in comparison, and far more prone to being lost due to the terrible lock-on system, or somehow the even worse cameras. They aren't all worse, to be fair. Fixed camera angles in boss fights tend to have met with some improvements, with a few notable exceptions, but in the bulk of the missions they're so much worse. Maps and locations tend to be far more open than before, which leads to having multiple fixed cameras for any given area. They're pulled back more, but not nearly enough, and you'll commonly have large numbers of enemies off-screen, or worse, just between camera angles, making it impossible to ever get a good read on where they are. While the inclusion of aerial combat is a step forward, and something that will become more central as the series proceeds, the low angles make it functionally impossible to judge enemies' exact locations in the air compared to your character, making hitting flying opponents a matter of luck more than skill. This is especially true of the occasional trigger devices in the air, which you'll need to hit multiple times rapidly to activate, and can't even lock onto at all. There is at least far more variety in the areas you'll travel through though. The general dark tone of the environments is maintained, but the types of environments are expanded dramatically. From old run-down Renaissance towns to the streets between skyscrapers of a modern city, underground ruins and industrial factories, there's a really good mix of locations throughout the game, and they maintain the dark gothic feel of the original, despite the specifics of the architectural style being gone and the tone applied to a far broader set of locations. Towards the end, areas even start to twist and distort as Arius' demonic influence begins to take hold in the world. The more linear nature of the game fits the mission structure far better than the more open map of the last, and it also means secret missions, though less varied in their objectives, are now hidden within levels you're guaranteed to travel through, not hidden behind you in parts of the map you have no reason to return to. The drawback is one of connectivity. There isn't always enough connective cutscenes between areas, so you'll often find yourself in a completely new area without any context as to how you got there. Both campaigns feature this problem, though it's more pronounced in Dante's. The two characters have distinct fighting styles, with Dante's being slower and more deliberate than he was in the original, while Lucia has access to faster but generally weaker attacks. The two campaigns take place concurrently, and will reuse some of the same maps in each. It's rare that they're reused as is, however. Most commonly when the same map is used, it'll be played through in the opposite direction, or at a different time, so the environments have changed due to the other characters having passed through, even leading you through a different path. There's only a couple of missions that use an identical layout in each campaign, and even then they still have a different set of encounters within. Unfortunately, most of these are towards the end of the game, where the missions become harder to navigate and your objectives become harder to find. There's clear reuse throughout, but it never feels like you're just playing the same campaign with a different character. They do feel distinct. They even have their unique annoyances. Lucia never has to escape an area with a timer, but Dante never has to deal with the somehow even worse underwater sections, so it's difficult to tell who gets off lighter in that regard. Actually, that's a lie. Dante gets off lighter. Lucia's underwater sections are truly awful. There's a couple of enemy types unique to each campaign as well, and more importantly, a few unique bosses too. Devil May Cry 2 features far more bosses than the original, and very few require repeating within a single campaign, though their quality varies wildly. Some are really bad, like the Infested Chopper or Trismagia. Absolutely infuriating fights where cheesing them with ranged weapons is your only real option. Most are just fine. There's nothing quite as memorable as Nilo Angelo, though the game tries in the form of Bulwark. He's exclusive to Dante's campaign and clearly an attempt to match Nilo Angelo's style by having an opponent who's more or less on par with Dante, who harasses you throughout the game. Unfortunately, the game's general reduction in difficulty makes him feel like a pushover in comparison, even with his annoying dogs helping him. Enemies deal far less damage and bosses have far less health, leaving most of them to be over before you can really get into the fight. The only bosses that take a while to defeat are those where melee options are limited and you're forced to fall back on ranged solutions instead. Of all the bosses in the game, however, one stands out in particular. This is another reason you should play Dante second. Lucia's final fight against Arius is decent in its first phase, though its second, where he transforms into a monster above you, is underwhelming. Dante instead faces Arius' master at the end, Argosax. Argosax's first form is one of the most irritating boss fights in the game. It's a cool concept, but the execution is weak. He takes on the form of a large immobile blob at the centre of the arena, but within are the heads and upper bodies of various bosses from both this game and the previous. It's a fun idea that would likely evolve into the boss rushes common in later games, but tackling them one at a time is a slow process, and the difficulty of dealing with each one varies wildly. It's less a contest of skill, more a question of can you work out which order to cheese the different heads in. The second form, however, is quite the opposite. The Despair Embodied isn't just the best fight in the game, it's arguably one of the better bosses in the entire series. They're quick, relentless, and visually spectacular while still maintaining a scale that makes sense. It makes for a genuinely engaging one-on-one that surpasses any fight in the series so far. It's also what I mean when I say despite being bad, Devil May Cry 2 is so close to being great. Just a few small tweaks to the game, an enemy with the right mix of aggressiveness and telegraphing their attacks, who pushes you to use the combat system to its fullest, and suddenly I'm having an amazing time. The combat in Devil May Cry was good, but would have needed expanding and placing in a different structure to improve the game. Devil May Cry 2 just needs some tweaks, a slightly better lock-on system, a little more range and speed to your attacks, improvements to the camera. The Despair Embodied is an example of how good the game can be when it's firing on all cylinders, and of what the development team behind the game could achieve at their best. It doesn't need much to take it from what it is to something amazing, and it's such a shame it didn't manage that. If you really can't stand the new combat system, however, there is good news. Hidden behind beating the game on hard, or behind inputting a code if you can't be bothered with that, is the series' first bonus character. Trish plays almost exactly the way Dante did in the first game, pause combos and all, with only the new dodge added to the system. It's interesting to face down the same enemies with the old mechanical toolset, and it's more interesting to see it's not hugely better. While the new has its problems, it certainly has more variety to it, and comparing it directly in the same game further shows that it's tweaks, rather than overhauls, that would be required to really elevate Devil May Cry 2 into something special. Unfortunately, it didn't get that chance. Unsurprisingly, Devil May Cry 2 had a pretty troubled development cycle. Capcom handed the game over to a different studio with no experience making this type of game, and Hideki Kamiya wouldn't be involved. In fact, it's difficult to pin down any single director, and the entire production had something of a rudderless ship feel to it. 6 months before release, Hideaki Itsuno would be assigned to the team to pull something together that Capcom could publish. Reports seem to suggest that very little was actually ready by the time he joined the project. Some even suggest that not only was none of the plot actually written, they barely even had the beginnings of a combat system in place. If half of what is said about development is true, then it's a miracle that the game came out even as well as this. Itsuno clearly wasn't happy with the results, however, and not wanting this to be his legacy, petitioned Capcom to let him take on the sequel as director from the start. They allowed him to. Much of the team felt similarly unhappy with how the game had turned out, and so many of the team remained on to work on the sequel as well. That sequel would be one of the best games of all time. Given my lukewarm attitude to the original and my generally positive one towards the sequel, you might be expecting some kind of contrarian viewpoint for the third as well. I'd love to. I love being a contrarian bitch, exactly the opposite amount of the next person, but even I have to admit that Devil May Cry 3 slaps. It took everything good about the first 2 games and improved upon it, then took everything bad about them and either removed it or reintegrated it in a way that works better. Devil May Cry 3 is the quintessential character action game, the Doom to Devil May Cry 1's Wolfenstein 3D, so to speak. This is the game, more than any other in the series, that every other character action game and many regular action games will draw from going forwards. Combat hasn't just been tightened considerably, but expanded as well. More weapons means more moves, and weapon switching has been re-implemented as a core part of the combat system. You equip 2 melee weapons and 2 ranged weapons at any given time, and can switch between them near instantly, opening the system up to all sorts of combinations. The biggest addition, however, are Dante's new styles. You start with 4 basic ones and are given access to a few extras as the game goes on. Each changes how Dante plays dramatically. Trickster gives you a dedicated dodge button, like Devil May Cry 2. Swordmaster and Gunslinger each add more attacks to their respective weapon types, further extending the possibilities of the combat system and, in the case of Swordmaster especially, significantly expanding your options in the air. Finally, Royal Guard adds a parry mechanic, which charges a powerful finishing move. Each is viable in their own way, and is very much a matter of which you personally enjoy most and fits into your playstyle. Some are easier to use than others. Generally speaking, the harder the style is to use, the more effective it is when used properly, but you're free to switch between them and experiment to some degree. That said, in most versions of the game, you want to settle on 1 or 2 relatively quickly. They level up as you use them, but they do so rather slowly. You can increase a few of them to level 2 without too much trouble, but getting any of them to level 3 will take the bulk of the game if you aren't replaying missions to grind out upgrades. Each gains new abilities and upgrades as they level up, but you aren't going to be able to max out all of them in a single playthrough, so if you constantly switch them out as benefits any given encounter, you're going to end up with all of them weaker than they could be. That's if you're playing the original or HD re-releases like I am. Devil May Cry 3 also has a release for the Nintendo Switch, which removes the restrictions on styles and weapons. All 4 basic styles are free to be switched between as quickly as you can switch weapons, and your available weapons are expanded to all of them at once. You can mod this functionality back into the PC version of the game if you want. I didn't for this playthrough, but either system has its merits and drawbacks. The game wasn't designed for you to have quite that much choice at any given time, so it does make it somewhat easier having all of your tools at your disposal at the same time, almost giving you too much choice. On the other hand, the original does feel like you're playing with one hand tied behind your back. Playing Trickster makes you significantly more mobile, and is much safer and easier for newer players, but not having access to Swordmaster severely hampers your combat abilities. Royal Guard is super powerful when used properly, but playing with it means giving up all the other options available, so it's a difficult proposition and not something you can really experiment with as much without dedicating yourself to it fully. The game was designed with these limitations in mind, and it works perfectly well, but only ever having access to a subset of your abilities feels limiting in some ways. It's strange feeling limited in a game with so much variety, but it comes from the difference between what you have access to overall and what you can use on a moment-to-moment basis. There are a huge number of potential combinations of weapons and styles, but it takes some time to settle on the ones you can get the most out of, since you don't have access to them all at once. This also means you're less likely to experiment with some of the more unusual pieces unless you're replaying earlier missions. Tackling new levels or higher difficulties, you want to be putting your best foot forward, which means maybe it's not the time to learn how to use the electric guitar that fires bats, and then you find there never is the time. A relatively standard sword and charged fists return from the original, but the new weapons add so much to the game that it's difficult to choose what you're going to limit yourself to. Whichever you do choose, however, you're likely to be having a good time. They're all well balanced and finely tuned, both individually and in the context of the enemies you'll be facing. That variety is maintained in the enemies, with a far larger roster of standard foes compared to previous entries. Like the weapons, they're more creative too, with not just a few standard melee and ranged enemies, but stranger foes too, like the chess pieces you fight throughout the game that culminates in fighting the entire board at once towards the end. It's apparent this time around that the development team had a clear view of exactly what it was they were making, no experimenting with the basics, just building on top of a solid foundation. This means almost every aspect of the game has seen significant improvements. No mechanic has been overlooked. The style meter has been upgraded to not only more clearly indicate when you're about to drop down a level, but now it also takes into account how frequently you use certain moves, prompting variety and experimentation. There are some fixed camera angles, but during combat the game usually reverts to one that follows Dante, making both grounded and air combat far easier to deal with. There are only a few boss fights where particularly fast opponents make it difficult to keep them in frame at all times, and even fewer where you're likely to end up blocking your view of the action. The lock-on has been tweaked, reverting to the system in the original but with far more precise soft lock, which, combined with the improved camera, all but eliminate those occasions of you accidentally attacking the wrong enemy. Even the mission structure has been improved, with it combining the cohesive single location of the first game with the clearer objectives and more easily navigable environments of the second. The Tower of Temen Nigru likely gets its name from Etemen Niguru, the Sumerian name for the Great Ziggurat of Ur, an ancient and vast Bronze Age structure built in the Mesopotamian city of Ur, which is now in modern-day Iraq. It's the best preserved structure of its type, though bizarrely much of that comes from the fact that large parts of the lower structure were restored and rebuilt on the orders of Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. Visually, however, the tower draws far more from Renaissance depictions of the Tower of Babel by artists such as Peter Bruegel the Elder or Athanasius Kircher. The biblical myth of the Tower of Babel is suspected to have been inspired by another Mesopotamian structure, Etemenanki, a temple to the god Marduk built in the ancient city of Babylon. Instead of Mesopotamian architecture, however, Renaissance artists chose to paint their renditions of the biblical tale as inspired by Roman architecture. The Tower of Babel being a tale of hubris, the Renaissance connected it with the Colosseums of Rome, with the stories of Christians killed within representing the height of hubris to their minds. The Temen Nigru of Devil May Cry 3 takes that basic structure of a tower that looks like someone stacked a set of Matryoshka Colosseums atop one another, and then builds upon it by using the gothic and sepulchral details that frequented the aesthetic of the castle on Malay Island. The result is a gorgeously atmospheric environment to slice your way through that still maintains a constant sense of variety by switching up the internal visuals throughout the tower's various levels and basements. The only thing I don't think is an improvement over the earlier games is Dante himself, and that's very much a matter of taste. The original version of him still feels like it had bits of Leon stuck to him, but while the first sequel matured him a bit and pushed him towards a more reserved attitude, here it's quite the opposite. It's a prequel, so Dante is younger, louder, and cockier than ever. It would be irritating if it weren't for the single most important attribute of his characterization, and it's one that becomes a defining feature of Dante going forwards. He's quite clearly having as much fun as the player, and it's hard to hold anything against him in that regard. There's a childish glee to everything Dante does, so no matter how annoying he might get, it's difficult to stay mad at him. He can be a bit of a hypocrite, however. He's very easily annoyed by other people acting as obnoxiously as he does, though there's only really one character who is as obnoxious as he is, and that's Jester. Jester sucks, and the boss fight against him added in the special edition release sucks too. He's loud and annoying and constantly feels out of place every time he shows up. I'd love to be able to say that he shouldn't have been in the game, except for one element of the plot that makes him kind of genius. He's the alter ego of the game's primary antagonist, Arkham. Arkham has basically the same plan as Arius did, but does it with so much more style. He wants the power of a devil, though in this case it's Dante's father Spada. To do so, he needs to manipulate the game's three other characters, Dante and his brother Vergil, and Arkham's own daughter. What makes Jester work is that he's the form Arkham takes to manipulate Dante by mirroring him, just as Arkham mirrors Vergil when dealing with him. When manipulating Dante as Jester, he matches how loud and annoying he is. When manipulating Vergil as Arkham, he matches his cooler, more meticulous personality. The reveal is even foreshadowed pretty heavily in their designs. Arkham and his daughter Lady both have heterochromia, two eyes of different colours. Not only does Jester share this trait, but both Jester and Arkham's eyes are red and blue respectively, matching the colour palettes of the brothers each aspect of him is manipulating. His daughter, Lady, is far easier to manipulate. She's there to kill him after he sacrificed her mother in his quest for power, and that vengeance makes her predictable. Aside from failing to see through the obvious lie that Arkham was possessed when he did all those bad things, Lady is a fantastic addition to the cast. There isn't a lot of depth or complexity to her, no more than any other character, but it's executed so enthusiastically that it doesn't matter much. What matters is that she maintains the tradition of every woman who meets Dante immediately trying to kill him, though she'll go one further and will continue to actively try to murder him for most of the game. It's a far more entertaining dynamic than having her as a love interest would have been, and watching the pair gradually grow to respect one another as the game goes on is great. The best part of the narrative, however, is the relationship between Dante and Vergil. Vergil is the polar opposite of Dante. Cold and serious versus flippant and obnoxious. Blue coat versus red coat. Daddy's boy versus mummy's boy. While Arkham is a plainly evil man who wants to become a god, Vergil is just kind of an asshole who wants the power of his father for no particular reason other than he believes he deserves it. The rivalry between the brothers is established fantastically. He's built up as a threat throughout the game in ways that aren't particularly original, though partly because they were so effective here that many other games have copied them since. You see him defeat Dante in a fight in the opening cutscene, he easily dispatches bosses you struggled against during cutscenes, he even goes as far as to collect his own upgrades as the game goes on, which you then get to fight against. Despite his much more serious attitude, however, he never feels any more mature than Dante. Scenes between the brothers are some of the most grandiose and melodramatic in the game, which doesn't just fail to cover up, but if anything enhances the sense of them being a pair of 7-year-olds hitting each other with sticks in the back garden. The game takes this dynamic, combines it with the exaggerated campiness of the original, and then elevates it to such heights that it works though. It takes itself so seriously that you can't help but do so too, and yet at the same time it always feels like it knows it's taking itself too seriously and is daring you to call it out. It should absolutely clash tonally, but it doesn't. It works. One of the reasons it works is because for all his characterization as a snot-nosed little brat, Vergil is a genuine threat mechanically, and easily a match for Dante himself. The game features around as many bosses as Devil May Cry 2 did, but unlike in that game, there isn't a weak fight amongst the roster. The developers' absolute concrete understanding of how Dante plays extends into the bosses, and they're each as tightly designed yet varied as the weapons you earn from beating them. The boss fights throughout are very much the highlight of an already fantastic game, each focusing on a specific element of the gameplay, benefiting from some specific approach. The rushdown brawler Beowulf, the various ranged attacks of Nevan, the 2-on-1 against Agni and Rudri, each is a tense and engaging fight that will test your skills and most likely find them wanting. The game is hard, far harder than its predecessors, though funnily it's easier these days. The original North American release boosted every difficulty up a level, in comparison to the Japanese release, meaning normal in the American release was equivalent to hard in the Japanese. These changes were reverted for the Special Edition and HD re-releases that are most common today. That said, the return to their standard settings by no means makes the game easy. It's rarely frustrating though. The mechanics are so refined and the encounters so tightly designed that it never feels like the game's fault when you fail. It's still engaging to tackle a boss several times, trying different tactics, bringing different equipment, because it always feels fair when they take you out. It's easier to improve too. The automatic mode has been disconnected from easy difficulty, allowing you to practice your skills in a more forgiving environment, though you can't simply drop the game down to easy to help with a specific encounter, you have to play through that from the start. It's not uncommon to have to face a boss a few dozen times on your first time through, and improving your understanding of both Dante and his opponents until you can overcome them is very satisfying. The game also takes a moment towards the end to show you how much you've improved from the start of the game, by having you face every boss again in a boss rush. Of course, of all the bosses, the toughest is Vergil. Like when you faced him as Nilo Angelo, you'll face Vergil 3 times throughout the game. The escalation between each fight, however, is huge. Vergil is perfectly matched against Dante in terms of power and speed. You aren't just fighting against an equal, you're fighting against what's effectively a variation of the player character. These kinds of fights are always the best in games, when you're evenly matched and on an even playing field. Vergil was so popular that this specific style of rival character that you face several times throughout a game became something of a staple of character action games going forwards, from Jetstream Sam in Metal Gear Rising to Donovan from Solstice. Even beyond that, however, the kind of fast-paced swordsman of incredible skill has become a regular element of the wider genre as well, with the influence of Vergil's fighting style being felt as recently as millennia of Elden Ring fame. Vergil is the quintessential example of this kind of fight, fast-paced, deadly, and requiring every last sliver of your abilities to overcome. It's not surprising then that Vergil is the peak of the mechanical experience, not Arkham. The fight against Arkham is kind of disappointing, though that does feel a little intentional. The giant blob monster is the most difficult to read and least interesting boss fight in the game. He's also dramatically easier than many of the fights earlier, a situation only made more unbalanced when the second phase of the boss fight powers you up instead of him. You get to fight alongside Vergil to finally defeat him, and it's a great moment on its own. The ability to work together really adds depth to the relationship, itself adding weight to the inevitable conflict between them. Making Arkham a penultimate boss also means there's no need for the player to finish him off, leaving Lady free to exact her own revenge before the game reaches its climax. The final fight against Vergil is an almost perfect final boss. It's so difficult, and yet feels so good to fight. It never feels cheap, or like the developer has a thumb on the scale. It's just an amazing fight that demands everything you've learned throughout the game, and frankly, I couldn't beat it without a helping hand. While in the eyes of some it may invalidate my opinion on the entire Devil May Cry series, I have to admit I used items to get through the final Vergil encounter. Not many, just a few little health top-ups to even the odds. As a series, especially from the third game onward, there's a reputation for the games demanding perfection, like you aren't playing properly if you can't S-rank every mission on maximum difficulty. This is nonsense. The thing that makes the games great is exactly the fact that they're just as much fun to suck at as they are to master. The tone, the gameplay are just as fun regardless of who's wiping the floor with whom. Devil May Cry 3 is a lot of people's favourite game of all time, and while it isn't mine, it's completely understandable why. It may not be very clever, but it knows exactly what it wants to do, and then does it with style. It's stupid anime bullshit turned all the way up, and I can't express quite how much I mean that as a compliment. I don't think any other game in the series would ever quite achieve the same level of quality, but with it laying the guiding principles of much of the series going forwards, they're never likely to be quite as rough as Devil May Cry 2 again. It was always going to be a tall order following up Devil May Cry 3, and the shift to a new console generation makes things more complicated. The team didn't do a bad job by any means, but there's something about Devil May Cry 4 that always felt underwhelming to me. Its combat always felt just a little slower, a little looser than before. This is even when using Turbo Mode, a feature added to the special editions of both Devil May Cry 3 and 4, which boosts the entire game's speed by about 20%. The game sets a different tone from the outset. You're introduced to the game's new protagonist, Nero, fighting a group of demons over a pseudo-operatic hymn, and then when he finally reaches the cathedral, Dante falls through the roof and shoots the Pope in the head. You then proceed to chase Dante through half the game, at which point you lose a fight against the final boss, then turn around to fight all the way back to the start as Dante. The heavy reuse of environments and bosses is the game's weakest element. The game feels kind of unfinished, but not in the way that it's unpolished, in a way that it feels like the developers didn't get to include everything they wanted to, and so what is there feels far more slight than it deserves to. This also affects the pacing of the game in a particularly strange way. Some environments you'll spend little more than a single mission in, others you'll be crawling through across several. There's a good variety in environments, the new hardware being used to great effect to implement both architectural and natural detail far above what even Devil May Cry 3 could achieve, and that game released extremely late in the PlayStation 2's lifecycle, so it was squeezing every bit of power out of the hardware. The Baroque city streets of Fortuna and the Gothic architecture of its icy cathedral are truly gorgeous environments, but you'll spend barely one mission in the first, while you'll be stuck wandering around inside the second for 4. The game rockets through some of its areas, and then struggles to pad the others, and that's before repeating the entire thing on your way back through. These pacing problems extend to the moment-to-moment gameplay as well. It feels like there's far more time spent on puzzles like the spinning tops in the cathedral or the dice game in the underground lab. The game lacks the sense of breakneck back-to-back fights as you travel through it, instead leaving you a lot more time of just wandering around. That's when you are in control, mind you. Cutscenes played a big part of Devil May Cry 3, with a pair bookending every mission and usually an extra couple for each boss, but here they feel far longer while also feeling less impactful. Part of this is true, the games are of comparable length, but the sequel features around 30 minutes more of cutscenes, but the other problem is the increased cast of characters. With far more people needing to speak, and a far more convoluted plot to get through, there's less time for everyone to be as memorable as the narrow focus of the prequel. I say the plot is more convoluted, in truth it's actually pretty straightforward, it just takes a long time to become clear, and spends an awful lot of time teasing details that don't really matter. The basic outline is this. There's a city named Fortuna where they worship Sparda, Dante and Vergil's demon father, who once fell in love with a human woman and fought against demons for humanity. The upper ranks of the church want to release a bunch of demons into the world to create chaos, and then use their artificial saviour to save everyone and thus take over the world. Simple. Another person wanting to control the power of Sparda, with an added false flag attack and a giant floating murder statue. Easy enough. All the time is spent, however, on minor details that don't much matter. A lot of time is spent on the how, and not nearly enough on the why or even the what. Take Gloria, for example. She gets what would have been the most over-the-top sexually suggestive introduction ever if it weren't for Bayonetta coming out the following year. She's a new member of the church, but rose in the ranks quickly for some reason. That reason is teased out gradually. She retrieved the Sword of Sparda for them, and her identity continues to be treated as a mystery. The reveal is that it's Trish in disguise, and she gave the sword to them in order to infiltrate the group. None of this is necessary, though. Trish's presence alongside Dante is good, they make for a fun pair of weirdos, especially when Lady is also included, but her presence as Gloria just bogs down the narrative in questions that don't need to be answered. They could have just as easily hand-waved a new MacGuffin for them to have used instead, and significantly tightened the narrative pacing by having her present solely as Trish. This, combined with the change in distribution of combat and non-combat segments, all works together to give the game a much slower feel. It doesn't help that the game primes you to not care about the narrative, since your character for most of it certainly doesn't. Nero spends the first part of his quest chasing Dante for non-specific reasons, since he certainly doesn't seem too devoted to the church in the first place. The rest of the game he spends chasing his love interest while shouting her name. Kyrie doesn't have a great deal to do in the plot, in fact she's functionally a MacGuffin herself. Despite all the time Nero spends screaming her name dramatically, the Save the Girl plotline is significantly blander and therefore less engaging than the petty sibling rivalry presented in Devil May Cry 3. Nero as a protagonist plays rather differently than Dante. Unsurprisingly, the character you play as is an important factor in character action games, and I don't enjoy playing Nero as much as Dante. He doesn't get any new weapons or different styles, he plays much the same at the start of the game as he does at the end of it, and it's a relatively limited skill set. The two major components are his permanently demonic arm, the Devilbringer, and his sword, the Red Queen. Devilbringer makes Nero a lot more manoeuvrable than Dante. He can use it as a powerful grapple attack, or to draw enemies to him, or him to enemies, depending on their size. It makes closing the distance on enemies a lot easier, and is a strong element of his arsenal. Its only drawback is that it's almost too powerful at times. It's never to the same degree, but at times it can devolve into something of a crutch, similar to the ranged weapons in Devil May Cry 2. It's never going to be the most effective option, but it's the easiest effective option most of the time, which can lead to an over-reliance on it, especially amongst weaker enemies. Many opponents and bosses are built around it as a central mechanic, however, which can create problems when Dante has to face the same enemies. Despite this drawback, I think it's a good element of his gameplay, easy to use for newer players but still leaving room to be utilised in interesting ways by experts. I'm not quite so keen on the Red Queen. The sword incorporates a motorbike handle into the grip, allowing Nero to rev the sword up and empower his attacks. Conceptually this is cool, but in action it has an issue. Each rev empowers one attack and only 3 can be held at a time. Revving the sword to maximum, however, takes a while and slows movements, limiting its effectiveness since you need to clear significant space to do so. You can instantly rev up the blade to the next level if you hit the trigger just after an attack though. Proper use of this mechanic allows you to chain together multiple high-powered attacks with devastating results. It's the secret to getting the most out of Nero, but the problem is, it's not a secret. The timing is very precise and difficult to execute properly. As a result, while Nero is a much simpler character than Dante in previous games, he's far more reliant on the technical execution of timing button presses. That execution, however, isn't hidden from the player. When playing as Dante in 3, learning new techniques in gameplay was usually connected to actually doing them in-game. Improving at combat was an act of exploration. As you learned you could chain together certain attacks, you also learned how to chain them together. The difficulty was in understanding how attacks connect, not necessarily in mastering the button presses required. At any given moment you felt at the peak of your power, with becoming more powerful being an act of uncovering new ways to combine your abilities. The only exception was Royal Guard, which required precise timing, but was also very much an optional part of your toolkit. With the Red Queen, however, you're very quickly made aware of this possibility. You know very early that revving the blade just after an attack will make you far more effective in combat. It's just a case of practicing the timing. The result is, you always feel less powerful than you could be. You aren't stringing together attacks any longer, unaware of more powerful options. You know every time you miss the timing that you're weaker than you could have been. You realised how weak you were as Dante by discovering you could be stronger, whereas with Nero, you always know you aren't playing as well as you could, because the way to be more powerful is always visible, you just can't execute it. Playing as Nero perfectly is likely far more powerful than Dante, especially given how many enemies in the game are designed around his toolset, but it's a lot more fun to play Dante badly because you aren't constantly aware just how badly you're playing him. You feel like you're playing correctly right up until you find a better way. With Nero, the distance between a casual player and someone who's learned him fully is far more visible, and therefore far less enjoyable unless you learn the timing. The other problem with Nero is attitude. Nero is every bit as arrogant and obnoxious as Dante, but with one key difference. Nero isn't having a good time. He's constantly annoyed and angry about what's going on around him. Dante, on the other hand, is having the time of his life. Nero's here because he has to be, Dante's here because he wants to be. When Nero meets Agnes, the researcher behind the church's demonic research, he angsts at him and makes fun of his stutter, an act almost as mean-spirited as giving Agnes a wildly inaccurate stutter in the first place. Dante, on the other hand, has a soliloquy off with him, competing to see who can ham it up and chew the most scenery under the spotlight. Consciously or unconsciously, an audience takes a lot of notes from the point of view character as to how they should feel at any given moment. If the player character is bored and annoyed by a boss, it's likely the player will be too. Character action games tend to focus on fun, exciting combat, so it's a huge benefit when your character is excited to be having fun as well. It's so much more engaging to play as Dante, not because his weapon switching and various styles give the combat more variety, but because he's clearly pumped to be getting into these fights too. This makes Dante's segments the better of the game's two halves, despite its relative length and repetitiveness. That said, it's no less oddly paced and comes with a set of its own flaws. If you've played the previous game, it's not so much of a problem, but it does throw you in at the deep end. There's no reduction in difficulty to let you get used to the new character, so you don't have long to get the hang of the much less mobile playstyle with the loss of Devilbringer and the much more extensive moveset available due to your styles. The upside is now you can switch between Dante's 4 styles at will using the D-pad. It's a great addition to what's otherwise a pretty similar toolset to the previous game. Unlike Nero, you also gain new weapons as you progress, though the reduced amount of combat encounters and massively reduced mission count means you don't have all that much time to get the hang of them. In terms of content, there's only a few new elements here. The levels are the same, just backwards, the bosses almost identical, there's a few new enemy types, however one of them is by far the most annoying in the game, and it's clear a huge number of the enemies you do face were built with Nero's moveset in mind. The game is easier overall, but with an attempt to more evenly balance the difficulty between bosses and regular enemies. The various enemies you fight tend to be tougher and often require more specific tactics to beat than before. At the same time, bosses tend to be a little easier to read and deal less damage. There's also been changes in more fundamental ways. The red orbs you use to unlock new abilities and buy items have been separated out into red orbs for consumables and proud souls for skill upgrades. This means you no longer have to choose between the two, which is a positive change. The general consensus amongst fans is that you aren't supposed to use items at all, but the game does seem to disagree this time. In 3, using items lowered your rank for that part of the end of mission assessment. Here, using no items acts as a bonus on the end screen, while using any amount of continues acts as a penalty. The game would consider using items in a mission, but completing it without dying, as favourably as using no items but needing to repeat a fight. Certainly to get the best rank you need to do both, but this time around the game is far less judgy about you using healing items than the community would have you believe. A change I'm less favourable towards, however, is the enemy handicaps. If you die on the same encounter or boss several times, the game automatically reduces the difficulty, either by adjusting the incoming and outgoing damage of a boss, or removing a number of enemies from a standard encounter. I'm not completely against this, but I wish it had been an option rather than a feature that activates automatically. Despite my misgivings, it's clear a lot of time and effort went into the basics of gameplay, both those elements that carried over from 3 and those that are new or changed. This is why the game can feel polished yet unfinished at the same time. The graphics may be far better, but the expense is far less original content than in the previous game, you just play through it more than once. This really becomes apparent in the end of game boss rush. You switch back to Nero for the final 2 missions, giving you a grand total of only 7 out of the game's 20 missions as Dante. The boss rush only features 4 bosses from the game, each of which you fought twice before, once as Nero and again as Dante. Worse, it requires you play the goddamn dice minigame to get through again. Even worse still, it doesn't include the best fight in the game. Credo is Kyrie's brother and Nero's superior and mentor in the church. He's also a fantastic fight. It's that specific kind of evenly matched one-on-one fight represented by Nilo, Angelo and Vergil before, and it's every bit as good as the former, even if it's difficult to live up to the latter. But again, you only face him once. Of all the bosses, this is the one that would have benefited from going a few rounds throughout the game, or at the very least a rematch with Dante's moveset. While the game surrounding it is far better in a lot of ways, like the despair embodied, it's a fight that's punching far above the quality of the rest of the game's encounters. Even the final boss is lackluster in comparison. The final boss of the entire game is simply a slightly harder version of the boss you fought at the end of Nero's first run of missions. A disappointing end. I don't mean to be quite so down on Devil May Cry 4. It's a solid game in most regards, better than the original certainly. It's difficult not to find it wanting playing it straight after Devil May Cry 3 though. It feels like a game with more potential than is on display. It's also, paradoxically, a game with far more content than its predecessors, despite much of it being repeated. This is mostly due to the Special Edition. The Special Edition of 3 added Vergil as a playable character for the entire game. The Special Edition of 4 would do this as well, letting you play through the entire game as Vergil, but you can also play through with Lady and Trish, replacing Nero and Dante respectively. Trish makes her return to being a playable character from the second game, but now her moveset is a custom job. It's a much simpler playstyle, effectively giving her access to both a sword and hand-to-hand weapons without requiring switching between them, which makes for a novel and adaptable system. Lady's debut as a playable character, on the other hand, is entirely new, far more focused on ranged weapons than even the most heavily invested gunslinger Dante. What's interesting is that the special edition came out far later. For 3 there was barely a year before the re-release, but here it wouldn't be until after the next game in the series that the developers would return to release the new version. This was something of a return to form, and an indication that the development team would be bringing this version of Devil May Cry back after a long hiatus. A welcome return at that time, since the next game would give even Devil May Cry 2 a run for its money as to quite how hated it would be. A new version of Devil May Cry to appeal to a Western audience. That was the mandate passed on by Capcom when they handed development of a reboot to British developer Ninja Theory. They'd previously worked on well-regarded, if not well-performing action games, such as Heavenly Sword and Enslaved Odyssey to the West, so they weren't a bad option to take the series in a new direction. Fans, of course, were livid. Fandoms tend to get very territorial over their chosen interests and react with great hostility to any imagined slight. The highlight of the controversy surrounding the slightly absurdly named DMC Devil May Cry was when the game's art director said that the earlier versions of Dante looked like a gay cowboy. The most interesting thing about this incident is that it never fucking happened. During a talk at GDC 2013, the developer in question was doing a talk about the art direction of the game, with a focus on the environmental design of Limbo and the redesign of Dante. Being fans of the games themselves, the team had hewn a lot closer to the original designs earlier in development, and Capcom producers had insisted they push it further. They requested it as designed for Dante as if he were in a Western film. Cue a tongue-in-cheek image of Dante from Devil May Cry 4, photoshopped into a still from Brokeback Mountain. The joke being, seeing as I need to explain it apparently, the conflation of Western the genre and Western the hemisphere. It was followed by the same image of Dante in a scene from Fight Club, a film more in line with the tone and aesthetic the development team had decided to pursue. The point of both images being to show how out of place the original Dante would have been. Quite literally, that he is not a gay cowboy, the opposite of what fans were getting upset over. Later images from the same talk also circulated, showing comparisons of various things, with one listed as Dante is not, and the other Dante is. Again, this was misrepresented as character analysis, rather than a statement of intent as to the new direction they were attempting. I've always described myself as skeptical of fandom, and DMC Devil May Cry is a good example of why. I recognise a lot of good can come from fandoms, creative works, friendships, community, but a lot of toxicity and hostility too. I'm very much pro-liking things, but I draw the line at defining a part of your identity as liking a certain franchise. I'll never understand the drive some people have to look at a group dedicating years of their lives and huge amounts of effort into creating something for people to enjoy, only to respond with vitriol and death threats when it turns out not to be exactly what they personally wanted it to be, followed by hastily misrepresenting or willfully misunderstanding creators' responses in an attempt to prove they deserved it somehow, or at the very least started the hostilities. You know, by trying to make something new for people to enjoy. The bastards. For what it's worth, DMC Devil May Cry contains a lot that's worth enjoying, but I'll openly admit it's weaker than its predecessors, and doesn't fit alongside them particularly well as an adaptation. I'd mentioned earlier that it's difficult to pin down the exact difference between a character action game and something like a hack and slash, but I think comparing DMC Devil May Cry to the rest of the series acts as a good example to get a feel for the difference. It plays faster than its predecessors, attacks come out a little quicker, reset sooner, are easier to string into other attacks. It's a fun system, but I'd argue the changes do shift it away from character action and into hack and slash. I think character action games are, in their way, more focused on one-on-one combat, and fighting groups of enemies feels more like juggling a collection of one-on-ones all happening at the same time. Here, it feels more like you're taking on the group as a whole. Any one enemy is usually trivial, and it's only in combination that they become a threat. Meanwhile, the toolset at your disposal is more tuned to fighting groups. It's far easier to hit multiple enemies with an attack. Shifting focus and changing from attacks to dodges is quicker. You even have the ability to pull enemies towards you or vice versa, similar to Nero's capabilities in the previous game. It all makes the game far easier to pick up and play, but this speed comes at the cost of precision. The differences are subtle, but playing it back to back with the others in the series they're noticeable, and doing so draws a pretty clear line between them as separate subgenres. This is why it is actually a shame the game is attached to the Devil May Cry series at all. Had it been its own thing, it would likely have been received far more favourably. It's a really good hack and slash. The only flaw mechanically is the typed enemies. You have access to 3 weapons at a time, your sword and then an angelic and demonic weapon. For the most part, these just act as faster attacks with wider range, or stronger, slower attacks respectively, but occasionally an enemy will come along that can only be damaged by one or the other. The wrong type of attack will just bounce off, leaving you to deal with them with less than a third of your regular arsenal. Whenever one of these opponents show up, it interrupts the otherwise fun combat for something much drier. Other than that, it's solid, a genuinely good time. The game really does suffer from comparisons to the rest of the series, and it doesn't do itself any favours by bringing attention to it. There's a sequence early on, one that particularly annoyed fans, where Dante makes a flippant comment about a wig that resembles Dante's hair from the Japanese titles. It's arguably the one sequence in the game that would actually feel in character for the other renditions, but being seemingly dismissive of that rendition just draws attention to how much less engaging the new one is. The big problem is that the developers are under the impression that Dante's defining characteristic was that he's cool. It's not. Dante is and always has been a massive dork, but a dork who's having a good time. Changing that to a hard-drinking, womanizing misanthrope with a potty mouth really doesn't do anything to ingratiate him with a new crowd and less an existing one. He's a 13-year-old's idea of cool. Devil May Cry has always been kind of childish, but it makes up for it by being so extravagantly childish that the presentation makes it engaging. DMC Devil May Cry, on the other hand, comes across as juvenile instead, with few presentational elements to redeem it. The exception is the environments. If I was being cynical, I'd argue that Limbo is effectively an excuse to eschew any kind of naturalistic world design in exchange for a series of floating platforms, but they're presented with such style and variety it's hard to defend that argument for long. It was released towards the end of the 7th generation of consoles, while the Western games industry was gradually learning it was allowed to be colourful again. The game presents the real world as drab and desaturated, but the majority of the game is bright and colourful, with some excellent environmental design. It's perhaps not the most original. The floating platforms in the Void aesthetic has been used from Far Cry to Dishonored to Alice Madness Returns, but there's a dynamism and an energy to the environments here that really does stand out at times. Unfortunately, while it's clear a lot of creativity went into the environmental work, the game as a whole has an unfortunate tendency to feel like something I've seen before. Not in a sense that I feel like they copied, just in a sense that it's unintentionally a product of its time and times before it. The new CEO Mundus is very much a riff on Peter Stormare's rendition of Satan from 2005's Constantine. The way subliminal and superliminal text appears in Limbo is reminiscent of They Live, if John Carpenter had been mad at his stepdad. Even the string of levels surrounding the game's sinister soft drink feels like a weird homage to Futurama's Slurm Factory. It could be argued that much of this acts as satire. Certainly the Raptor News Network segment supports that assessment. The particular villain, Bob Barbas, is just about the least subtle parody of Bill O'Reilly you can achieve before getting sued, the game having been released at the height of the man's popularity before he was deemed too toxic for even Fox News to associate with. This segment has some of the strongest visual design in the game, taking place in the upside-down reflection of the city as you make your way towards the vast tower hanging far beneath you, before beating up Barbas's giant smug face inside a world built from the news program's on-air graphics. It's also where the game's commentary is at its most overt and its shallowest. It's not the game's fault. Concepts such as information control are heavy, dense subjects that require a great deal of effort to engage with properly, and the focus of the game is sword-slinging action. It would take a game far more narratively focused and cohesive to do the topic justice. Without that focus, the result is something with the cadence of commentary, but barely the depth of observation. Raptor News is at once a news organisation and a surveillance network and a demonic prison, conflating all sorts of topics into a single messy whole. Yes, the truth can set you free, but in upside-down world lies are used to imprison you. How very clever. You are 14 and this is deep. Again, the shallowness of engagement with the topics is an inevitability, and I do have to commend the team for at least trying to incorporate such elements, but the result just adds to the juvenile tone, a tone not helped much by the presentation of the game's women. A peculiarity of teenage boys is the combination of obsession and fear that women elicit within them. This kind of viewpoint is present in far more media than just DMC Devil May Cry, but it's interesting that it presents both sides of that dichotomy. Women come in three forms. The first are sex objects. Literal strippers for Dante to have sex with in the opening cutscene to prove how cool and awesome and not like your dad's Dante he is. The second is objects of grotesque horror. The succubus is one such creature, sidestepping the obvious presentation of being sexy by instead being a huge bug-like monstrosity leaking its foul juices into the supply of soda and swearing at you. Lilith also falls into this category. She's Mundus's mistress and is carrying his child, which culminates in a boss fight against the unborn creature still attached to its mother. All the horrors of childbirth and women getting plastic surgery or wearing age-inappropriate clothing rolled into a single encounter. The third role women take are as functions to the plot. This is most obvious in Dante and Vergil's mother who dies off screen to motivate the pair, and so every other boss can call her a whore. It's also present in Cat. Cat is the only other speaking member of Vergil's underground resistance against Mundus that recruits Dante at the outset of the story. The game tries hard to characterise her and give her depth, but it never succeeds in doing so. It can't manage much more than giving her a traumatic backstory. She's an active participant in the narrative, but only in the way Dante's sword is. There are attempts to paint her as important. She comes up with the final plan to assault Mundus' skyscraper, for example. She's the one who helps Dante and Vergil access Limbo throughout the game, but none of it comes about as a result of who she is, rather what she can do. She's also the crux of the twins' rivalry, and at one point a literal bargaining piece, as Mundus captures her and the brothers trade Lilith to get her back. Both women exist as pawns to be used by the game's men, culminating in Vergil shooting the pregnant Lilith in the stomach and then head just to piss Mundus off. These elements all combine to create that sense of immaturity the game has about it. The swearing, and the shallow commentary, and the presentation of women, it all reinforces that underlying sense of a game imitating maturity without understanding its essence. Like a teenager who didn't really understand Pink Floyd's The Wall, but is ready to make it their entire personality for the next few months. There's nothing necessarily awful about it, worth bringing up, but not uniquely terrible by any stretch. But attempting maturity and failing is far less engaging than the previous game's active indulgence in childishness. A lot of this tone comes from Dante himself. Having him seem indifferent and annoyed all the time makes him feel more like Nero in a lot of ways, and repeats the problem of it prompting the player to also be annoyed and indifferent. The script tries to humanise him, and it isn't awful at it, but there's too many layers of disaffected nihilism to make him relatable. He's also just a little off-putting. The narrative wants him to be this handsomely devilish bad boy, but his design just doesn't bring that across. Again, it's very much a teenage boy's idea of what's attractive in a man. There's a fun anecdote about the character Flynn Rider from Disney's Tangled. During development of the character, the design team pulled in every woman they could find to critique their work, dissecting which elements were attractive to them and which weren't. Apparently, they were pretty brutal. For Dante, the team say they combined elements of various handsome men, in much the same way Flynn's designers did, but it seems like they really could have used this kind of active feedback if he was to come across as believably attractive in the way the script wants him to be. On the other hand, Vergil's new design matches his characterization really well, with one minor and super weird caveat. He's slightly aloof, slightly superior, and all that comes across well. At the same time, he's put together well enough that it's far more believable that Cat may have a thing for him. The caveat being, it works better in the original release than in the definitive edition. The big change for the re-release on the next console's generation, funnily enough released the same year as Devil May Cry 4's special edition, is that typed enemies now take reduced damage from other sources rather than being immune, a hugely positive change. The weird change is they removed Vergil's stupid hat. The trilby Vergil wears for much of the start of the game is such a good representation of his new character, someone who's acting friendly but secretly thinks he's better than everyone, that it genuinely weakens his design when it was removed in the definitive edition. It's also just a weird change to make in a re-release on its own. The rivalry between Dante and Vergil works well for the most part, right up until it doesn't. Cat and Vergil being the only members of his movement that you ever actually speak to does undercut the implied scope of what he's been working on before he finds Dante, but working alongside him and the relationship between the brothers is some of the strongest writing in the game. There are weak moments, sure. If you've played it, you likely know the precise one I'm talking about, but for the most part there's a good sense of two people working together, but fundamentally differing in ways that start to chafe over time. It's a little disappointing that a lot of the underlying rivalry seems to revolve around Cat, but it feels natural for the most part. The moment it stops working is at Vergil's 11th hour heel turn. Vergil being the final boss is the kind of obvious inclusion that had to be in the game for brand recognition, but the inclusion hurts the game rather than elevating it. There are hints here and there throughout that Vergil's plans may not be as benevolent as Dante believes. He certainly takes a more brutally pragmatic view of the people working under him, but the sudden shift in the final mission to a tyrannical desire to take Mundus' place as ruler happens far too suddenly. The moment really needed to be relegated to a sequel to give it time to feel natural, even when the sequel never came. As it is, it makes for what feels like a tacked-on afterthought of a final fight that isn't even as strong independently given the mechanical shift that makes combat work better against groups than individuals. Again, it's a case of the game being weak in the context of the series, but not being as weak on its own terms. The gameplay is fun, just not in the way the other character action games are. The story is competent, but held back by its perceived responsibilities to the franchise. On its own, it's an engaging and entertaining game, but it's just not Devil May Cry, despite it appearing in the name twice. They clearly thought they were getting a sequel, at least judging by the DLC. Vergil's downfall is a short experience, part epilogue, part stinger for a sequel that would never come, and all disappointment. In a half-dead state, Vergil must take on ghostly visages of Cat, Dante, his mother, and then finally himself to regain his power. Before that sounds too interesting though, realise that the only one of those that gets a boss fight is himself. Effectively a slightly truncated repeat of the fight against Vergil in the main game, only now with an added phase where you can't attack and just have to wait for him to finish firing projectiles at you. Projectiles you don't even need to move for, given Vergil's ability to dodge in place. I don't want to call it low effort because no work of game development is. Acts of creation are hard and even the weakest works of art take massive amounts of effort to bring together, but it is certainly a weaker outing than the main game by far. The environments are even more basic renditions of themed platforms floating in a void, with the most common theme being rocks. Without any of it seemingly actually happening, there isn't even much character development beyond Vergil becoming power-hungry and bitter at Dante for beating him. The whole thing exists to set Vergil up as the head of the new demon hordes for a sequel, but they wouldn't get one. Even playing as Vergil isn't a particularly strong reason to experience the DLC. He's got a much smaller moveset than Dante, slower and more deliberate too for the most part. It has the weird effect of actually pushing the combat back towards character action rather than hack and slash, but doesn't do enough in that regard. It ends up being the worst of both worlds, lacking the precision and the specificity of the earlier games, while also lacking the easy to pick up experience of its base game. The result is far weaker than either system, and it drags the experience down dramatically and makes for a disappointing ending to this branch of the franchise. I wouldn't have been disappointed if DMC Devil May Cry had got a sequel. The base game is solid, if flawed, much like the original Devil May Cry. With some refinement and time to develop its own identity further, there could have been a decent crop of new action games out of the reboot, and it wouldn't have been that much of a loss to the subgenre either, given character action games were still going strong with the release of the excellent Metal Gear Rising the same year. That said, I'm glad things turned out how they did. Ninja Theory would instead go on to develop the Senua games, each far more interesting and original in their own right than any sequel to this game was likely to be. Meanwhile, the franchise would return to its Japanese developers, and its original continuity, first with the special edition of Devil May Cry 4, and then with a full-bodied sequel. Devil May Cry 5 is a fantastic revival of the series. In the same way Devil May Cry 3 did, it takes much of what came before it and either discards it or refines it. At this point though, there's such a strong understanding of the fundamentals of gameplay that the game is free to experiment with its mechanical periphery as well. The result isn't just a fantastic core gameplay loop, but one that has genuinely unique and interesting elements differentiating it from what came before. Like in 4, there's a mix of protagonists. Nero and Dante are joined by newcomer V, with all three of them presenting distinct fighting styles while still feeling unified in terms of the experience of playing. Nero seems to have faced the most changes of the returning protagonists, though only at first. His grapple arm, the Devilbringer, is still present in all its glory, but you don't gain access to it until the very last mission of the game, meaning you'll only really get to use it on a second playthrough. This seems like an odd decision at first, but like the guns of Devil May Cry 2, it had a tendency to become a crutch if you let it. By restricting its use to a second playthrough, a player is already going to have a strong grasp of the character, and it can be integrated into the player's mechanical toolset much more cleanly. In its place are the Devil Breakers. They add a huge amount of much needed variety to Nero's playstyle, while still separating him further from Dante. Each Devil Breaker shares some universal abilities. They can pull enemies towards Nero or Nero towards larger enemies, maintaining his mobility from 4. They can also be used to create an area of effective explosion that breaks Nero out of grabs and knocks back surrounding enemies. Their primary attack also grants reduced damage and immunity to knockback when used, allowing them to act as an emergency parry. These two abilities both destroy the Devil Breaker, however, as does using a charged attack from one of them, replacing them with the next one in your magazine. You can't switch them at will, and can only rearrange their order at rest stops. This adds a really interesting layer of strategy to the combat. Each has a regular ability which is useful situationally, but you need to strategize about when it's best to use it up and move on to the next. It can be a powerful sacrifice to get you out of a tricky spot, or you can just blow it deliberately to bring in another one more suited to your current situation. They're powerful, but overuse can leave you without one to use at all until you reach your next checkpoint, and even then it costs to replace them. You can't rely on a powerful Devil Breaker to muddle your way through an encounter like you could the Devil Bringer, but at the same time, their limited capacity allows them to be even more powerful to help you in an emergency. It's the kind of mechanic that could have been super annoying if balanced incorrectly, but it's so well integrated that it adds a huge amount of depth and moment-to-moment decision-making, which really enhances Nero as a distinct character. Tweaks have been made to his sword as well, a very small tweak but a fantastic one. It still revs up like before, with the same mechanic where well-timed revs as part of an attack will fill the gauge instantly. Importantly, however, it no longer slows your movement to rev it up normally. You don't have to hang back for fear of getting rushed down, it can be used far more aggressively. This not only reduces the time a player would spend hanging back from a fight, but also encourages its use even amongst less dexterous players who may be struggling with the attack timing. It's still a central element of his skill set, but now there's no drawback to experimenting with it, allowing it to be used more freely. The refinement to his playstyle goes hand in hand with the game's shift to make Nero the protagonist of the series. This was apparent in 4 as well, but it becomes clearer as 5 goes on. Having such a solid baseline character, however, and one that the player base is likely to already have experience with, frees up Dante to start getting weird. The absolute basics are still there, you still switch between your 4 styles, and the variations on your basic sword all still play more or less the same as they did in 3 or 4. Your additional weapons, however, have become far stranger. Even the fist weapon you start with has moved away from its role as a slow charge-up mechanic that's been standard since the first game. Now it's a dual-mode weapon. One, a nimble, dodge-focused boxing moveset with a few powerful finishers, the other a kick-focused series of attacks that combine capoeira and breaking. That's joined with a souped-up version of the triple nunchuck from the third game, now with added fire and electricity elements and a bowstaff form, as well as a motorbike that splits in half to create slow, wide-ranging attacks that hit multiple enemies. Of course, you can't forget the cowboy hat Faust either, that you can throw on your enemies. When an enemy is wearing it, they drop more red orbs when you attack them, but at the same time, you lose red orbs when they hit you, creating a risk-reward loop for using it. The game can get so experimental with these additional elements because it's got such a strong baseline to build from. All of these weapons and abilities are there to be used and integrated into your playstyle, but the basics of the sword and style systems are so solid that you can never touch them at all and still make it through fine. The most experimental playstyle of all is that of newcomer V, however. When Nero was added in 4, he was far too similar to Dante in terms of personality, just worse since he was the significantly more miserable of the two. In 5, both have matured somewhat. Nero's a little more laid back, still angsty but less so. Meanwhile, Dante is far older. He's starting to get tired. Each feels more grounded, more human, which oddly makes their personalities feel more distinct in the same way their mechanical changes did. V manages to establish a personality all of his own right out the gate. He's a mysterious figure, clearly knowing far more about events than he's letting on, and his connection to those events are gradually revealed through the narrative. He's also physically far weaker than either of the other two, and these elements all combine to inform his playstyle. In terms of controls, V plays the same as the others, a melee weapon and a ranged weapon, each controlled with a mix of pause combos and special attacks executed by locking onto an enemy and combining an attack with a direction. What makes him distinct is that his weapons might be the other side of the room when he does so. V only has one direct attack himself, a finishing move with his cane to destroy weakened enemies. His damage comes from 3 summoned demons, an electric eagle for range, a panther for melee, and finally a giant vaguely humanoid blob monster as a substitute for his devil trigger. The 2 regular demons can also be set to automate their attacks at the expense of someone with your special meter, but for the most part you'll have direct control of their actions. It is such a deeply bizarre playstyle, and unlike anything I've encountered in a character action game. The way your demons attack from a control sense are the same, but them being disconnected from your character changes the experience dramatically. Playing as a character where your actions are separated across 3 different places in the field can be very confusing at first, and it takes far more getting used to at a basic level than the other characters. Once you do start to get the feel for it though, it's an amazing time. If you understand the reference, this is the closest I think a game has come to really making you feel like you're playing as a stand user from JoJo. The balance of time spent between the 3 characters is better. You still play as Nero mostly for the first half and Dante for the second, but having V to break things up intermittently throughout helps with the pacing a lot. Given how unusual his playstyle is, it's predictable that V has the least missions of the 3 though. I really like how he plays, and he makes me wish not only did he have a little more depth, but that you could play the entire campaign as him too. I fully suspect others will hate playing as him however, so I understand why limiting his playtime was probably a safer choice. His segments also tend to be far easier than Nero or Dante's. Part of this is, again, likely to be connected to not wanting to force the players into mastering something so different, but most of it is a result of his basic mechanics. Since you control the demons at the same time as V himself, you're likely to spend much of your time hanging back while your demons dive into the fray on the other side of the arena, before rushing in for the finishing moves before quickly retreating again. It's not passive, you're still actively attacking aggressively, but at the same time you're focusing on moving your character out of harm's way. With 3 bodies at a time, you can both charge in and attack while hanging back defensively. The demons can die, but will revive on their own or faster if you're near them. It makes for a character that is both more aggressive and more passive, more technical and less at the same time. It's a fascinating experiment, but also one that seems like the developers wanted to go further with it. There aren't many repeated bosses in Devil May Cry 5. In fact, for the most part, the only repeats are the primary antagonist who you fight in several forms throughout, but the exception is V's final mission. It's another boss rush, and a rather short one at that, but unlike previously, they're all fights from one of the other 2 characters' missions. Since V plays differently enough, this still feels like a fresh take, and it's notable that the 3 bosses chosen are significantly varied from one another. One's a ranged heavy opponent that keeps you at a distance, another is a large and aggressive beast with wide-ranging attacks, and the final one is more akin to the one-on-one swordsman fights where you and your opponent's skills are matched evenly. Despite the relatively short length of V's time as the player character, this means you still get to experience a wide range of boss types from his mechanical standpoint. Having had so many games in the series at this point, and the existence of other character action games beyond, it's not surprising that the development team have such a strong understanding of the game's fundamentals. The thing is, this familiarity also extends to the players. The game is far easier than 3, and even the original, but this understanding and expectation of understanding allows the game to push things even further despite that. This culminates in the reappearance of Nilo Angelo from the first game, not as a boss this time, but as a regular enemy. An elite version of a regular enemy, but something you'll fight alongside regular mobs, and even 2 at a time. He's a little weaker, but has the same basic moveset as the earlier encounters from the first game. Since both the player and the developers have a better understanding of what the game is, how it's played, this peak of mechanical challenge in the original can slip in far more naturally into a game built around fights like this. Nilo Angelo isn't the only reference to the earlier games. Unlike 4, the game is heavily invested into the existing narrative of the franchise. With the exception of 2, which only gets about that many sentences in the history of Devil May Cry cutscene, every prior game has some influence over the plot this time around. Even DMC Devil May Cry seeming to hold some minor thematic influence over the work, with the appearance of Dante and Vergil's family home, and some general grounding of character designs and attitudes. Despite this, the basics are very simple. A new demon, Urizen, has grown a gigantic demonic tower in the middle of the city of Redgrave, and you need to stop him. The city and the tower make for a mixed bag in terms of environments. The city itself is interesting, presenting a demon apocalypse vision of London, but the tower is a little weaker. From the outside it's impressive, like if Yggdrasil was made of wasps' nests, so people with trypophobia should probably avoid the game, but the interior is less interesting. Mostly a combination of rocky, bony innards that, while visually impressive, don't feel all that original, lacking any specific or notable central elements in exchange for high-density detail instead. Urizen makes for a compelling enough villain at first. The first 2 times you fight him he remains seated and only uses one arm to defend against you, making for an engaging escalation of power when he does finally stand up. He does just show up without fanfare though, and that lack of specificity should clue you in that there's something more going on. Almost every supporting character from the earlier games returns except Lucia. Kyrie only appears over the phone or out of shot, but Lady and Trish are back and are joined by Dante's fixer Morrison and Nero's new gunsmith Nico to upgrade his arm. It's a well-rounded cast, but the return of so many characters should likely be the second clue as to what's really up, especially when you consider just how much of the history of video focused on Vergil. That's right, Urizen's demon tower, his quest for power, it was Vergil all along. Specifically, Urizen is Vergil's demonic half. Before the events of the game, a broken and heavily wounded Vergil found Nero and stole his arm, then used the sword Yamato held within to separate his demonic and human halves. There is something really compelling about the narrative of Devil May Cry, and much of it is in the combination of over-the-top presentation and narrative beats with ideas grounded in the world's lore. Yamato was used to separate the demon and human worlds, so it makes sense it could also be used to separate the demonic and human halves of a person. Absolutely absurd story beats, backed up by completely sound internal logic. V is that remaining human part of Vergil, who seemingly has realised what a mistake it was, and is the one who originally recruits Dante to face off against Urizen. If Urizen had been Vergil's desire for power, the part that had driven him for so long through the events of the third game, while V represented his connections to Dante and to humanity, that would have been good. It's how the narrative presents itself for much of the game, but it turns out it's not the case. V is just as power-hungry as his demonic counterpart. That aspect of Vergil is constant. His goal was never to kill Urizen, he wants to reabsorb him. It's his power, and he wants it back. Vergil's characterization hasn't wavered a bit since 3, and so the final run of missions is dealt with facing off against him, since he refuses to just kill Dante immediately after regaining his true form. Dante had just fought Urizen after all. Defeating him while he was tired from the previous fight would mean nothing. Working your way towards the final confrontation means facing off against V's demons. They're separate from Vergil now, having been created from his nightmares while he was trapped as Nilo Angelo back in the first game. What's striking is just how much subtlety is conveyed in their dialogue with Dante. For all his bravado, there's an underlying sense that Dante is glad that his brother is finally free of those nightmares, and is pleased to be putting them to rest. At the same time, for all their bravado, it's clear the demons wanted Dante to win, to defeat them once and for all so they could be at peace. It's shocking to see subtlety in something so exaggerated and melodramatic as the rivalry between Dante and Vergil, and yet it's the presence of that subtlety that makes it so compelling. It's also why neither of them can be allowed to win the fight. Like their boss fights, the two are most interesting when they're the most tightly matched. Neither can definitively win, or that interest is lost. At the same time, they can't ever only fight. There always has to be a sense of brotherhood underlining it all, a sense that the two can put aside their differences, even if just temporarily, to face a greater foe. Dante's fight with Vergil is amazing. The boss fights in general are excellent, but Vergil's is just as well executed and just as well balanced as before, if a little easier in general. Despite the game rarely reusing bosses from one character to the next, most work well even when faced with a different moveset, as was shown by V's boss rush. The same can't be said for Vergil, who is tightly attuned to Dante, perfectly matching and countering his specific rhythm of play. This is why Nero's version of the fight is just a little unsatisfying. Nero, it turns out, is Vergil's son. This was suspected during the previous game, but never officially confirmed until now. Having recently discovered his heritage, he's sick of his dad and uncle constantly fighting, and is determined to put a stop to it. As a narrative beat, I'm fully on board, but mechanically, this fight against Vergil just isn't quite as well tuned. This is especially true given on a first playthrough, it's when Nero finally gains access to the Devil Bringer and his own Devil Trigger, making it feel like a slightly gimmicky fight, which does let down the ending a bit. Only mechanically though. With Nero enforcing peace between the brothers, their attention can be turned to severing the tower and stopping the encroaching demon hordes. The ending is as dumb and campy as the rest of the series, but it's kind of perfect in that way. It wraps up the game nicely while leaving the series in a position where it can end just as easily as it can continue. Dante and Vergil remain in the demon world, free to fight as much as they want while taking breaks to work together to fight demons. Meanwhile, two teams, Nero and Nico, Trish and Lady, remain to manage the two branches of Dante's demon fighting business. Any of these characters remain available for future games, but at the same time, there are no plot threads left to tie up. There's a part of me that hopes this is the end. I wouldn't be upset at a sequel, but the series has been nothing if not volatile in its quality. The director of the series since the second game, Hideaki Itsuno, has left Capcom in the years since Devil May Cry 5's release, so any future work would have to be under different leadership. In my mind, it makes sense to end the series on a high note and let the teams move on to new projects. And it'd be hard to end the series on a higher note than Devil May Cry 5. Thanks for watching.
Yeah.